All right. Looks like I am recording, yes? Okay, cool. All right. How's it going? So, hey everyone, welcome to the introduction writing workshop meant for basically the biology research courses here. So today we're going to be talking about writing the intro of scientific papers. So again, welcome to our first writing workshop. Oh, sorry, real quick. The next workshop we're going to host is Wednesday, October 2nd at 7 p.m. Same time, it's just 3 weeks from now. So just want to give you that heads up. You'll get emails, but I'll let you know now. All right, so welcome to our first writing workshop. My name is Riley Thoen, and I'm a graduate student here at UGA. I'm a PhD candidate, and I work in the Franklin Division of Biology, and I support writing in the biology research courses. Besides that, I am in the plant biology department here at UGA, and I study the effects of climate and habitat patchiness on the persistence of native plant species. Additionally, you'll see on your screen here Dr. Kristen Miller. She is the director of the Division of Biological Sciences, and she is really my supervisor for this position and runs the biology resources labs. And then lastly, I do want to give a special thanks to Dr. Margot Popecki. She was in this role prior to me and really set up the groundwork for a lot of these slides and these workshops. All right, so just to get started here, for the biology research courses, the faculty-mentored undergraduate research courses, many of you probably know this, but there's a 10-page research paper due at the end of the semester, specifically on midnight of reading day, or 11:59 on reading day. And this workshop series here is initially made to support writing in the biology research for credit courses. But I do know that this has been disseminated widely to the biology department. So in general, this workshop, what it should be good for is generally helping everyone who's here to participate or improve their writing skills, learn about writing scientifically, specifically the intro. After all, there's a lot of writing you have to do in classes here at UGA, and to my knowledge, pretty much every science job that you can participate in will have writing to some degree, whether that's in academia, whether it's in a medical field, or any sort of industry or professional space, like a government job. So today what we're going to be doing is focusing on the specific elements of scientific writing, first talking about the style of scientific writing, then talking about searching for references, and lastly, we're going to finish, and kind of the main part of our talk today is going to be about writing the introduction of your research article. And lastly, I do want to mention two quick things. First, that new this year for the biology research for credit course, we have a course ELC, and you'll be submitting your final papers to the ELC, and we're also going to be running a peer review option, an optional peer review session in the ELC. So you can submit a draft and get it peer reviewed by another classmate who submits a introduction to be peer reviewed. And then lastly, feel free to reach out to me, Riley Thoen, to schedule any sort of conferencing, any help with your writing one-on-one. I'd be happy to help, whether you're in the biology research for credit or in any biology course here at UGA. Okay, so you're all doing research to some degree, whether it's faculty-mentored research in the biology department or in some class. And so you're all going to be engaging in the scientific process. So this may be familiar to a lot of you, but the general scientific process that most of us engage in starts off with simple background research of a topic you're interested in. So reading journal articles. Then once you've done that and gathered a bunch of knowledge, you can think of an idea, or you might identify a knowledge gap. So we know a lot of stuff from the articles you just read, but there's some things that we maybe don't know. And you identify that knowledge gap. From there, you can plan an experiment to close that knowledge gap, to answer that knowledge gap, in other words. And then, of course, run that experiment, collect, record, and analyze your data, and via that analysis, come to some sort of conclusion. Of course, when you're doing science, it would be great if this was always a very linear path from researching topic to coming to a conclusion, but I'll note that this is often an iterative process where we're doing multiple experiments to answer the same question, maybe because experiments fail, or we're analyzing data a few different ways to make sure our results are robust. Notably, though, there's something that's missing from this sort of infographic here, and that is communication. So scientists, although we can come up with some really cool things, you're all going to find some probably really neat things this semester. No one's going to know about it unless you actually communicate your science. And so we need to know how to communicate effectively and pass our knowledge on to other scientists or the general public, so we can grow our collective knowledge as a scientific community. So the first part of communicating science, like I kind of just hinted at, is identifying the target audience of your science. So the first target audience, maybe more of a broad one, is we think of like a broad general public audience. And there's a few ways we can communicate science to a broad audience, whether it be a magazine article, a TED Talk, a outreach event, or my personal favorite, a documentary. And I am indeed quite partial to River Monsters, hence why it's covering everything else here. Great show. But we also need to communicate our science to other professionals in our field and other scientists generally. And the way we do that is through a research article, talks at a conference, or even presenting a poster at a conference. And this semester, the reason many of you are here is to learn about improve your skills writing scientific research articles. And I'll note too that scientific research articles are the main way by which we communicate science. When you're reading an article and you're citing something, you're citing other scientific articles that have been read before. So primary scientific literature always goes through the journal article. We do communicate some in person and in conferences, but the main way we cite things is this article, and it's really important to know how to write it and communicate effectively. So again, the purpose of the research article that you'll be writing is communicating scientific knowledge through writing. And specifically, your objective is communicating that research article to a scientific professional audience. And I underlined the broad scientific professional audience here because within a research article, any sort of science article, there's a few ways that scientists communicate that in writing that maybe other folks from other fields may not have taught you, or they don't communicate the same way in writing. So it's important to understand sort of the way by which scientists communicate in writing. And there's a few style tips I'm going to give you here and on the next slide to help you with that. So the first thing is using the active voice. So the active voice is where essentially when you're writing a sentence, the subject of the sentence is performing an action, rather than an action being performed on the subject of the sentence. So a really good example here is for active voice. I will always remember my first trip to Boston, passive voice. My trip to Boston will always be remembered by me. In that first one, I as a subject, remember subject performing the verb. And that's not the case in the passive voice. And I'll note here what's great about the active voice is it's a lot clearer what's being said, a lot less wordy. And when you have a lot of passive voice built up, I'll note quickly it gets quite convoluted. All right, next is you want to make statements in the positive form. This essentially means using verbs that convey an action without describing what the action is not. This really helps with being more concise, so being more efficient with your words and clearer. So here, a positive statement would be, he usually came late. More evasive statement was, he was not often on time. Again, positive has fewer words, it's more concise, and additionally, it is a lot clearer. Like, usually came late is much clearer than he was often not on time. That could mean a few different things. And speaking of that, we want to make sure we're using specific and concrete language in our writing. So we want to say exactly what we mean. We want to report things exactly as they happened. We don't want to mislead our audience in any way. For example, for that is for concrete, it rained every day for a week. A wordy version would say, a period of unfavorable weather set in. Concrete, once again, the blue one, a lot more concise, and much more to the point. You don't know what a period of unfavorable weather is. It could be anything from rain to snow to maybe there was a hurricane or tornadoes or something. And this is really important in science because a lot of times scientists want to quantify things. And so it rained every day for a week is frankly a really good way of just casually quantifying something in text. Lastly, we do want to use formal register, which is just, using formal word choice essentially. This is going to be kind of field specific as to how folks generally write in your field, but a good example would be instead of using the word bug, we'd want to use the word insect. Insect's more formal than bug. Okay, so in addition to the general scientific writing guide, this is an introduction workshop, so I do want to give you a little bit more of style of writing the introduction. So unlike the rest of the scientific paper, and actually I'll note quick, this is in the guidelines on the ELC and also on the biology research website. So if you were looking for guidelines for the paper, you should be able to find them there. And this is a part of that. So the first thing when you're writing the introduction is you're actually going to write the introduction in the present tense. We usually write a lot of the other sections in past tense. So that's going to be like the methods and results, but introduction is in present tense. Next, when you're in your introduction, you're really laying the groundwork for your paper, and we'll get more into that in a bit. But in your introduction, you need to make sure you're defining everything that you mention, specifically key terms. If there's certain terms that you expect a reader might not understand, you must define that. And if you have an acronym that you want to use, make sure the first time you mention that acronym, this is right here at HPLC, you put the acronym in parentheses after initially listing the entire, full set of words. This paper you'll be writing for the biology research course, and I would expect most classes, is for a broad scientific audience. So I would suggest just making sure you define as many terms as possible that might be convoluted that a regular, entry-level biologist might not know. Okay. Additionally, you want to make sure you're using really specific language so when someone's reading it, they know exactly what you're trying to say. Essentially, you want to walk your reader through exactly what you're saying in the introduction, exactly what your theory is, logic is behind, your knowledge gap and your question. Additionally, you want to make sure you're using stuff like we hypothesize X, we ask Y, things like that, so readers can specifically find what you're asking, what you're hypothesizing. And then lastly, your intro shouldn't be too long. I usually recommend 2 to 5 paragraphs, especially for this 10-page paper here. But also make sure you're addressing the major components that we're going to talk about in a bit here. Okay, so while all these components I've mentioned on the last 2 slides are important to follow, it's important to note that they're only the most important things to follow on a final finished draft. When in reality, writing is a process, and it's kind of a long process. So you don't always need to follow this specific syntax when you're writing in certain parts of the writing process. And I'll talk about that in a bit here. So first thing that you're going to do before you start writing, especially the introduction of your paper, is you want to familiarize yourself with literature about your research question. This is just going to be reading the literature, and this is especially true, again, for the intro, because you really contextualize the beginning of your introduction with related literature. Next, and a lot of people don't do this, but I do it, and I do suggest doing an outline to organize your writing. So what you want to do in your outline is really just consider the message. So you want to have your main points considering these are the main thing I want to say in this paragraph and that paragraph. For instance, what are your research findings? How can you convey them clearly and accurately to your audience? You can do this all in your outline. An outline's great because it'll help you organize the flow of your points and your entire paper. And then it makes writing a rough draft really easy because you've really outlined the entire structure of your paper. And frankly, this can be kind of the most difficult part. Thereafter, once you have an outline, or you don't have an outline, the goal thereafter is to just do a first draft writing content. And what I mean by this is, I know people don't like this, but I like to say word vomit. Essentially, just stream of consciousness, write down, what the logical flow of things is in your head. That should be going on a page. And of course, a lot of times, if you have an outline, it should be following that outline. Your sentences by no means have to be perfect yet at all. They don't even have to be coherent. As long as you understand what you wrote, all you need to be doing here is connecting your ideas and getting your general ideas about what you want to write, your narrative, down on a piece of paper. Then you can edit for clarity and flow. You can read through, make sure you clarify any points that you made that aren't clear upon rereading, ensure that there's a logical flow of your ideas, and consider, at this point, matching the style of scientific writing to what you initially wrote, which probably wouldn't match that. For me, it just, for what it's worth, it never matches. My first drafts are always disgusting. All right, and then finally, you should be reading the whole paper to yourself to make sure the whole narrative makes sense, and do any additional editing. Ask yourself if you can improve clarity anywhere. Can we improve our writing with an additional citation? You can reach out to your TA, advisor, lab mates to do any sort of review. And additionally, you can submit your introduction to the ELC to do any peer review for the biology research course. All right. So like the scientific process, though, you're going to be visiting all of these steps many times. It's not a linear, like you do this once. You often do a lot of revisions, and often I find myself having to make multiple outlines and writing multiple first drafts if I'm not happy with the previous ones. But you'll get there eventually. Nevertheless, what we're going to talk about here is first familiarizing yourself with that literature surrounding your question. So the first thing you got to do, again, like we said, is become familiar with, no, I got to chat. I'll address that later. So the second thing we're going to talk about here, besides general flow of a paper and scientific formatting, is the gathering together resources and sources for your introduction. So the first thing you want to do when you're gathering sources for writing your introduction or writing your science paper is, I would suggest asking essentially your advisor or lab mates for papers they would recommend. They've read more papers than you, more likely than not, and they will suggest good ones. Thereafter, I would recommend reading articles that your lab has published, especially and specifically the ones that are related to your project. Then you can use any sort of search tool, whether it be Google Scholar, the UGA library, to look for articles that are related to what you're interested in. In this case, I usually search keywords mostly related to the methodology or the research questions that other articles have asked. If you need help with this, I can assist with that, but I would also really recommend the UGA Science Library and librarians. Essentially their job is finding the stuff you need for your research. So that'd be really great if you schedule an appointment with them. All right, and then lastly, and this one's kind of my favorite, is looking up references from the article you're reading. If you're reading an article and you see an excerpt that's really good, someone says something that's great, and they cite it, you should go to that paper, because what's in that paper is probably good quality content. Notably, when you're actually gathering references together, in general, I recommend using references within the last 10 to 15 years, just because the rate at which technology and methodology changes. But it's always good to cite pivotal work. Pivotal work, especially at the very beginning of your papers, is really useful for contextualizing your research in the broader literature. Okay, as for actually organizing your references, a lot of people, what they do is use reference managers. So this is stuff like Mendeley, Zotero, EndNotes. And what you can do in these is basically upload PDFs of your articles to these, and then you can take notes on the PDF and then organize your articles into specific folders with, again, the notes on them. What's also great about these is that they can generate citations for all of your articles. Sometimes they don't work as well with like older articles because they're not big good PDFs, they're just like scans. But this can be really useful for generating bibliographies. And they can do it in a number of different formats as well. I will note, while they do generate like works cited bibliographies, they do not, to my knowledge, they do not generate citation for in-text citations. So make sure that you're following the format you're using for citing the way that they do in-text citations. Additionally, what I like to do is I usually keep an alphabetical reference list in like a Word document or something. So I'll, download a paper, read it, and then put the citation in a Word document and then alphabetize them, everything that I've read for a specific paper. And with that information, I'll often make an annotated bibliography. So not only do I have the references in that list, but I also have a summary of all those research articles, where I essentially describe the key findings, any sort of interesting methods that are useful, and how they might specifically relate to my research paper. And this annotated bibliography is really helpful because it's really easy to just be writing something in your active paper and then just be like, oh, I need a reference for this thing. And then you can just search a keyword in your annotated bibliography and you're good to go. Awesome. All right, so moving along, let's talk about the structure of scientific articles. So we just talked about style of scientific writing and how it's used to convey information effectively. But the structure of scientific articles is also designed to convey information effectively and efficiently to other scientists. So we have 4 general sections of a scientific paper: the introduction, methods, results, and discussion. And there's also the abstract, which is kind of another section. It's just like a summary at the beginning of the paper. And in general, these 4 sections follow what I like to call sort of an hourglass shape. And what this hourglass is referring to is how broadly, or specifically in the thinner parts, you're referring to outside literature. So in the introduction, what you're doing here is you're referencing other literature, other broad literature, to motivate your research. Then you identify a knowledge gap, a more specific knowledge gap, and then get very specific into your study, into the design of your study, into your hypotheses, into your results. And then once again, with your results in hand, you talk about your results in the context of other literature, broad literature, in the discussion. And of course, your conclusions and implications should refer generally to, should be quite broad. They can be quite broad, especially in relation to the scientific field generally, as well as just humanity itself. So of course, today, we are focusing on the introduction. And in the introduction, your goal to do is to provide readers with background so they know exactly why you're doing the research you're doing and why you asked the specific question you asked. If this purpose is not clear at the end of your introduction, the rest of your paper will likely not make a ton of sense because it's not going to follow the same narrative as the introduction. So in that sense, despite being at the top of the hourglass, the introduction really is sort of the base and foundation of the paper. It sets the table, and for that reason, knowing that you have to plan your whole paper ahead of it, it makes the introduction tough to write. And for me, it's actually probably the hardest section to write. All right, so let's get into it. So the introduction, again, is the top of, let's go back here, is the top of this little hourglass, and that makes it into this little inverted pyramid because it starts really, really broad to grab the attention of the audience, and then gets very specific when you're talking just about your own study. All right, so in the introduction, the first section of the scientific paper's introduction is contextualizing. What this basically means is you're identifying a really broad question, a really broad motivator for your research. You're putting your research into the context of the broader literature. You're giving it purpose. You're making it interesting to readers to want to read more. Additionally, in this same section, you can describe existing work. Again, still contextualizing your research broadly. You're first identifying the general problem in relation to other science generally, and then describing what's been done to address that overall broad question, that broad motivator that you've introduced already. In this describe existing work, we can ask questions like, why do we care about this? What's already known? And by the end of that section, what should happen is there should be some knowledge gaps that start to form, that naturally form as a part of you describing the existing work. And this is the conceptualizing stage. So we're pointing out the gap in the knowledge at this point. So after describing what we already know, now we got to point out what we don't know. There's going to be open areas to investigate, and you should explicitly state that at this point in the introduction, at the conceptualizing stage. Clearly state what's unknown, and this is going to read perfectly into the resolving stage, where you state your specific objectives, including hypotheses, questions. Maybe you can get even a little bit into the methodology at this point. Any capacity, you're saying how you're going to address this knowledge gap through questions, hypotheses, objectives, etc. Okay, and Dr. Popecki's advisor said, this is Dr. Stangerhall, a quote is, your hypothesis should feel inevitable by the end of your introduction, such that you're essentially filtering broad scientific knowledge into, to say, why is this important? And what do we know about it? To what don't we know about it? And then stating those specific objectives. And of course, this introduction at certain parts is going to take references from other literature. So throughout your introduction, what you're going to be doing is putting in references to essentially frame your research. You want to put your research in light of previous research and make your purpose really clear, and you want to justify why you're asking these questions, why you're asking the question you are. So essentially framing is just including relevant background information, which means that the background information you include must have a direct connection to your research question. So for instance, if you're studying the effect why fireflies flash in synchrony, you want to provide background on firefly mating behavior and flash biology, as opposed to general information about fireflies, like the life cycle or developmental stages or diet. This diet stuff, this other stuff is still interesting to know, but it doesn't fit into the purpose of you actually crafting your message and making your research objective clear, which again is about flash biology. Additionally, I'll note that you really want to put references in your introduction, mostly, not exclusively, in the top and middle of your introduction. Again, that's when you're contextualizing, so putting it in light of broader literature and providing background on what's known, and then also conceptualizing. In other words, pointing out a gap in the knowledge. Okay. So, with all of this in mind, we're going to do a little bit of an introduction activity where you can interact in the chat. So again, just keep in mind, I'm going to have this on the next screen, that this introduction, this inverted pyramid, is going to be very relevant for this activity. So what we're going to do is we're going to go over 3 different sections of an introduction of a paper by Landris et al. 2013. And your job is going to be to put the excerpt of text into one of these categories. Is it the contextualizing section, the conceptualizing section, or the resolving section? Okay, let's do it. So, where is the inverted pyramid? Where in the inverted pyramid should this paragraph go, and how do you know? I'll give you maybe a minute and a half to read this, and then if you can share in chat which of these three, contextualizing, conceptualizing, resolving, you think that this specific paragraph might go in the intro. All right. So we got more chats. All right. So a lot of people pretty much have this in chat, but that's correct. This is the resolving part of the introduction. This, of course, oh, go back there, is where, of course, the problem is addressed. You can tell by the explicit language, this study aims to determine the environment and hormonal factors underlying morphological color changes. This study aims. They're addressing the problem. And also, at this point in the introduction, they're talking a little bit about their methodology and how they're actually going to address that problem. Of course, we don't actually know what that problem is yet. So let's see what this next passage is from. I'll give you this passage here. And again, which section of the introduction does this passage belong to? I'll give you about a minute here. Right, got some replies here. Y'all are doing great. So that's correct, everyone. This is contextualizing. So again, talking about putting this in the context of broader literature, of a broader motivator, of a broader question. So let's identify that application of this research / broad question in yellow. Here, pigment patterns are classic traits used to study adaptation and the generation and maintenance of phenotypic diversity. It's a great opening sentence, basically saying that this is something that's been studied for a long time as kind of a scientific, almost a model system in a way, a model question almost. And so this is going to be interesting to other scientists. What is already known? And of course, you have a list of things that are already known. For instance, cryptic coloration allows some animals to escape predators by matching their background. That is something that's already known. This is, again, more of just listing what's already known. And then lastly, I do want to say citations are used here specifically as parenthetical citations. So they're putting the author's name and then the year, sometimes et al. But I will also note one important aspect of scientific writing is that we never really quote anything. It's rare to see anything quoted. If we want to, take some information from another article, we'll paraphrase it and then cite that article in text. Heck yeah. And I will say too, don't try to quote another article and then don't put quotes on it. That's plagiarism. All right, last little excerpt here from the Landris paper. Which of these sections does this one belong in? All right. So this excerpt here is conceptualizing. So this is the point where we're identifying a knowledge gap. The knowledge gap here, stated right in this area, while some of the metabolites involved in ambascia color production have been identified, nothing is known about the internal hormonal mechanisms controlling color production. So that right now there, and they introduced a lot of stuff before this, tells you exactly what this paper is going to be about. Nothing is known about the internal hormonal mechanism controlling color production. And of course, like we saw earlier, they do eventually resolve this at the end of their introduction. Okay, so in summary of the flow of our introduction, here's the question that you should be asking yourself when you're writing your introduction. And this is in the correct order. What broad question or wider application drives your research? What do we know? What is the gap in knowledge? How will you close the gap? Why is your study system ideal for this research? And what is your research question and hypothesis? And what's nice about this is you can use this list of questions doing revisions. So if you have a draft, you can go over this list of questions, and one thing I would suggest doing is underlining or highlighting whatever you do everywhere in your text that addresses these questions. And if you see that one of these questions isn't addressed or isn't clear, make sure you clarify it. That's a really good way of kind of reviewing yourself. And we're going to do something like this in a bit here. Okay. So now that we've gone over the basics of the intro, I'm going to introduce something that I've always had close to my heart. It's called an ABT. And hopefully this will help you all start outlining your own introduction and help you work on another aspect of science communication, which is oral communication. So one kind of critical component of communication is an elevator pitch, whether you're at a conference or someone just asks you about your research, and you need to explain your research in under a minute or so. Being able to effectively describe your research is really critical in taking subsequent career steps and really motivating your research. For instance, grad schools are really going to look for someone who can concisely talk about their research and motivate their research to, their selection committee, for instance. So in your elevator pitch, it's really important to take, rather than talking about the specific methods, it's important to take a big picture approach. You really want to strongly motivate the research, tell your listener of a knowledge gap, and describe your specific question and how you're going to answer it. You can get into the results as well and what you found. But one thing you'll notice is that this elevator pitch essentially follows the structure of an introduction. And there's a way we can kind of scaffold this in something called the ABT, the three simple words. And, but, and therefore. ABT. Here's what they mean. So for contextualizing, we know X and Y, but we don't know Z. Therefore, I am doing this to address Z, the knowledge gap. Very straightforward, 4 sentences. Also, a quick side note, didn't say this before, but this is Dr. Stuart Wagenius. He introduced me to the ABT concept as a professor at the Chicago Botanic Garden. So getting more sort of into the details, for the and, there's kind of 2 sections of this, but before the and, what we say is we want to give a broad motivation. Again, we want to contextualize our research in the broader literature, like we talked about with the intro. And then you also want to talk about existing work. So we know some broad motivator, and we also know existing work. But we don't know this knowledge gap. Therefore, I'm going to summarize what I'm doing to address the knowledge gap. So that's an ABT. And again, it's these 4 sort of like sections here that really follows the structure of the introduction. So I'm going to give you a brief example here of an ABT that I might give, that I wrote here a couple days ago. So, self-incompatible plant species require pollen to form seeds and successfully pass their genes to future generations. And if pollen receipt is too low, seed production will be lowered, a phenomenon we call pollen limitation. But characterizing the environments that pollen limitation is strongest has been a challenge since many plant populations persist in relatively homogeneous habitats. Therefore, I'm performing a supplemental pollination experiment on patches of Helianthus porteri that vary in size and water availability to test when pollen limitation most strongly limits population growth. So here, at the beginning, I'm giving a broad motivator. This is kind of a conservation motivator. Basically, we need pollen to produce seeds for future generations to persist. Then I get into what's known. And I will tell you now, there's a ton known about pollen limitation. This barely covers it. But again, this is a really short elevator pitch. So it's you can consider this, again, a really short elevator pitch, or even the topic sentences of your paragraph in the introduction. And then the but, of course, I'm identifying a knowledge gap and why there's a knowledge gap. And then lastly, I'm talking about what I'm going to do and put this in the context of the broad motivation. So I'm saying that I'm interested in pollen limitation and figuring out when it most strongly limits population growth, again, with that conservation spin I talked about at the beginning. And I'm going to be honest, so I looked at a paper that introduction of a paper I was writing that is very similar to this, and I found that essentially the 4 sentences or sub-sentence fragments from this ABT almost perfectly matched to 4 of the topic sentence of the paragraph, the introduction. So it's really cool. All right. So what we're going to do now is a little activity. It's going to be a personal activity, so I'm not going to monitor anything. But I'm going to give you all 5 minutes to write an ABT about your research based on background information you know now. So basically, you're going to get a chance to just write out an ABT. It's totally up to you to do yourself, but hopefully this will serve as a really good, scaffolding for your introduction section, and also a scaffolding for the elevator pitch that you might want to give. I'll start the timer in a bit, but I will say if you don't have a project at this point or aren't familiar with your research yet, you just might want to think of a scientific question you're interested in. But if you do need an idea, I recommend this scientific question. Which fast food chain has the best French fries? Give us an elevator pitch, or ABT, for that scientific question. All right, so again, I'm going to give you 5 minutes, and after that, I'm going to give you a chance to engage with your ABT that you just wrote with some self-reflection questions. All right, I'm going to start the timer now. right, everyone, my timer just went off here. I hope the writing went all right. If you're not finished yet, that's a-okay. You're going to get another chance to do some reflection here. So what we're going to do here is after you have your written ABT, which let me be clear, is going to be, for me, I'm far from perfect. I mean, mine took like 15 minutes to write, so take some time. But what we're going to ask you to do here is that you should read through your ABT that you just wrote and ask the following questions. What broad question or writer application drives the research? What is already known about the problem? What is the knowledge gap? And how are you closing the knowledge gap? And you'll note that this format really follows these first two questions and 3 but 4 therefore. So again, I'm going to give you 3 minutes here to answer these questions for yourself. And if you feel like you didn't answer them as clearly as you could, maybe you could do some editing to, sort of address those questions and make sure you're answering them in a more clear way. So I wish you all the best, and I will see you back again in 3 minutes here. All right, everyone. My timer just finished up here again. So I hope that the ABT and ABT self-reflection was helpful for you all, and you were able to, get a nice scaffolding there for your ABT and setup, which hopefully can serve as a scaffolding for your introduction. So what's next? Like I just actually said, ABTs are a great little elevator pitch. You can use it at a conference with friends or family, but you can also use the ABT as a potential scaffolding for your introduction section, namely as topic sentences. You might consider them as topic sentences for your introduction. So maybe you can get a good start on your outline or a first draft of your intro here. Okay, so real quick, just an administrative thing before I get going. I want to talk about peer review we're doing. So this semester for the research credit courses, we're going to be running peer review, but in first year, we're going to be doing it for the intro of your research articles. So we have a peer review form to help guide your review of other people's papers that have some of those questions that we talked about earlier that you might ask yourself about, what is the motivation for this, for example? What's the knowledge gap? If you want to participate, please submit an introduction draft to the Dropbox on ELC by next Wednesday, September 18th, by midnight. And I'll note that even if you're not in biology, the research faculty mentioned research, you can still participate in peer review. You can just email me. I'm going to be coordinating the peer reviews, sending them out to you all via email anyways, so email is fine for me as well. You may ask, why do peer review? Well, there's a few reasons for that. One, you can get a jump start on your paper, so you're writing parts of your paper before the end of the semester when finals is happening. Second, it gives you an audience outside of your TA, or me, for instance, for your paper, so you get someone else reading it, and that can always be fun to have someone engaging with your work. Next, you get to practice your revisions. And this revisions are a critical part of the scientific process generally. Peer-reviewed literature is pretty much all revised to some level. So it's really important to get to know how to revise from feedback and practicing that, because it takes practice to get good at it. Third, when you review someone else's paper, it gives you good insights into what worked and what didn't work. So you can transfer that insight into your own paper. And then lastly, it really makes you be metacognitive of writing. So basically, it makes you think, what makes this writing good versus what makes it bad? You're kind of taking a step back from the writing and why is this good? Why is it bad? And of course, you can apply that once again to your writing. There's a revision guide that'll help you, engage metacognitively. It's on ELC with your own paper as well. And then lastly, I'll just note that students are really good at giving feedback. This has been shown in studies. You are all coming from a similar, place as one another. So giving feedback to one another can often be more effective than when a professor gives you feedback. All right. Lastly, I just want to point out the science library can really help you finding resources. You can schedule appointments with the McBay Science Library with the librarian so they can help you find resources for your research project. And you can also schedule a conferencing with a writing tutor in Park Hall at the Writing Center. And again, I'm also available for conferencing. At any time, just send me an email. And then lastly, I do want to say thanks to a few people, namely Dr. Krista Miller, Andrea Funk, and Margot Popecki at the Biological Sciences, and then also the Writing Intensive Program, Dr. Lindsay Harding and Laura McKee, who helped with my training for this semester here. So with that said, our next workshop is going to be 3 Wednesdays from now, October 22nd at 7 p.m., also on Zoom. And I want to say thanks for coming, and let me know if you have any questions. I'll be sending an update to the biology research students about the ELC and peer review stuff in probably tomorrow here. But let me know if you have any other questions. And I'm obligated to share photos of my dog because that's what we do. So thanks so much, y'all.